Elijah Rivers sat by the classroom window, his pencil tapping out a quiet rhythm against his notebook. It wasn't nerves, just a habit, something his mother always told him to stop, though he never did. It helped him think. Outside, the sun warmed the brick walls of Jefferson Middle School in Little Rock, Arkansas, while inside the usual sixth-grade chatter hummed through the room. But Elijah wasn't part of the noise. He liked to get his work done early. Stay ahead, stay quiet. Miss Abigail Thornton stood at the front of the class, flipping through her notes with practiced ease. She'd been teaching here for nearly 15 years, long enough to know how to command a room without raising her voice. Parents said she was firm, but fair. Elijah wasn't so sure about the fair part. It was never anything direct. She didn't call him names or raise her tone, but when his hand was up, she'd look right past him. When he got the right answer, which was often, she moved on like it didn't matter. And when he made a rare mistake, she lingered just long enough to let it hang there in the air. Not everyone noticed, but Elijah did, and so did a few of the other kids. "Yo, she barely even sees you." His classmate Tyler leaned over one afternoon and whispered, smirking, "You got like teacher invisibility or something." Elijah had only shrugged. "Guess I do." But something was different today. Miss Thornton kept glancing his way, not with irritation, but with something else, like she was waiting. The lesson began, a straightforward talk on the Civil War. Elijah listened, took notes, waited for her to ignore him again. But then came the surprise. "Elijah," she said, her voice clear and deliberate, "why don't you take this one?" Every head turned. Elijah blinked. She never called on him. He sat up a little straighter, scanned the question on the board. General Sherman's March to the Sea was a military campaign aimed at breaking the Confederacy's resources and morale. He answered steady and sure. Miss Thornton gave a slight nod. Not bad." The class stirred. Tyler looked over, the eyebrows raised. Something had shifted, and Elijah felt it too. Miss Thornton wasn't ignoring him anymore. She was watching. And whatever was coming next, he could feel it wasn't just about a history lesson. The bell rang, slicing through the last minutes of class. Backpack zipped. Chairs scraped the floor. Elijah began gathering his things, moving with the quiet rhythm he always did. But just as he reached for his bag, Miss Thornton's voice rang out again, crisp, almost too casual. Elijah stayed behind for a moment. A few students paused at the door, glancing back with raised eyebrows. Tyler gave him a look, half curious, half concerned. Elijah didn't say a word. He just nodded and took his time packing up, waiting until the room was nearly empty before walking slowly up to her desk. Miss Thornton sat with her hands neatly clasped, her expression unreadable. "I overheard something yesterday," she said, her voice light, like she was making small talk. "You were telling someone about your grandfather." Elijah blinked. "What about him? You mentioned he was a musician?" There was a shift in the air, small but sharp enough to notice. Elijah nodded cautiously. "Yeah, he was a pianist, played jazz." Miss Thornton leaned back just a bit, tapping her fingers along the edge of the desk. There was the faintest twitch at the corner of her mouth, not a smile. More like satisfaction. "Interesting," she said. "I imagine you must have picked up a thing or two." Elijah paused. The words were ordinary, but something in her tone made them feel loaded. He didn't like it. "A little," he answered carefully. She nodded slowly, as if filing something away in her mind. "Good to know." And just like that, she dismissed him with a glance toward the door. But as he turned to leave, she called out again. "Tomorrow, let's see what you've got." He stopped. "Excuse me." She pointed toward the old, upright piano in the corner of the classroom, the one that had been gathering dust for years. "You'll play something for the class." Elijah stared at her. A couple of students still lingering by the door were now frozen, watching him with wide eyes. "Why?" he asked. Miss Thornton tilted her head the way someone does when they've already decided something but pretend they haven't. "Why not?" "You said your grandfather played. I'm sure you have inherited some of that talent." There it was, that tone. Not curiosity, not encouragement. A challenge wrapped in a polite smile. Elijah knew exactly what this was. It wasn't a real invitation. It was bait. She expected him to say no or worse to try and fail. This wasn't about music. It was about putting him on display, a chance to turn the spotlight on the quiet boys she usually passed over. A quiet test dressed up like an opportunity. But Elijah had learned a long time ago not to back down just because someone expected him to. He gave a small nod, his face calm. Okay. That night, Elijah couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the hum of the ceiling fan, a dull backdrop to the storm in his mind. He replayed her words again and again like a tape stuck on loop. Let's see what you've got. She wanted to see him trip over the keys, fumble through a melody shrink under pressure. She wanted to confirm what she already thought, that he was unremarkable, invisible until he proved her right. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Elijah hadn't just picked up a thing or two from his grandfather. He had lived and breathed music since he was 5. Sitting beside his grandfather in humid summer afternoons, watching those strong, worn hands dance across the keys like it was nothing. He remembered the warmth in the room, the smell of coffee and vinyl records, and the way the notes seemed to rise like smoke, curling into the corners of his world and settling there. He remembered practicing late into the night when his fingers ached and the house was quiet. The way his mother smiled when he played eyes closed, swaying gently like she could feel every note. Miss Thornton didn't know any of that. She saw a quiet kid with nothing to say, and tomorrow she'd find out just how wrong she was. When Elijah walked into the classroom the next morning, the shift in energy was immediate. Whispers followed him to his seat. Looks were exchanged. Word had traveled fast and messy like it always did in middle school. You really gonna play? Brandon Hall smirked from across the room, loud enough for others to hear. Elijah didn't look up. Didn't know you were a piano guy, Tyler murmured beside him, his voice softer, more curious than mocking. There's a lot people don't know, Elijah said quietly. Miss Thornton walked in with her usual calm, setting her books down with a certain finality. She gave no indication of what was coming, but Elijah felt it ticking behind her, every movement like a clock winding down. The first half of class dragged on in a blur. Elijah heard none of it. His eyes were on the board, but his mind was back at home in his grandfather's living room, hearing the low, rich tones of a blues scale echoing off the old wood floor. Then finally it came. Well, Miss Thornton said, closing her book and glancing at the clock. We've got a little time before the next lesson. Perfect. She turned her eyes, landing squarely on him. Elijah, let's see what you can do. The room went still. A few kids sat up straighter. Others leaned in. One or two chuckled under their breath like they were already bracing for something awkward. Elijah stood slowly, not in a rush, not afraid. His steps to the piano were steady, controlled. Someone whispered something he couldn't quite catch, but he didn't need to. He knew what they were thinking. Miss Thornton clasped her hands. Play whatever you'd like. He looked at the piano, old, worn a little out of tune. A couple of keys were chipped. The bench creaked as he sat. He placed his fingers lightly on the keys. And he smiled. Because what they didn't know, what Miss Thornton couldn't possibly have seen, through all her assumptions, was that Elijah Rivers was about to play not just for the class, but for every quiet kid who'd ever been overlooked. Every soft-spoken child someone had mistaken for weak, and tomorrow they would remember his name. Elijah stood before the old, upright piano, hands at his sides, heart beating slow and steady. The room around him had fallen into a hush so complete it felt like time had held its breath. Even Miss Thornton, always composed and certain, seemed to waver just slightly, arms crossed, as if bracing for something she could already predict. Some of the students shifted in their seats, exchanging quick glances. A few leaned in, eyes sharp with curiosity, or maybe waiting for a reason to laugh. One voice near the back let out a muffled snicker, low and expectant. But Elijah didn't flinch. He ran his fingers lightly over the worn ivory keys, feeling their age under his skin. The instrument was far from perfect. Some keys were stiff, others chipped at the edges, and it was a little out of tune, but it was enough. He'd learned long ago that it's not about the piano, it's about the hands playing it. He took a deep breath, sat down on the bench, and let his hands find their place. Then he began. The first few notes drifted gently into the silence, slow, warm, and full of soul. A soft blues progression, the kind his grandfather used to play on sweltering Arkansas afternoons when the air hung thick and the only sound was music slipping through open windows. Elijah's left hand carried the rhythm steady and grounding. His right hand explored the melody, with grace telling a story through every rise and fall. The classroom changed. The whispers stopped. Even the snickering faded away, swallowed by something deeper than surprise. Tyler leaned forward, lips parted slightly. Madison, seated in the back with arms folded at the start, had gone still, her eyes focused. Brandon, who had cracked a joke earlier, sat with his jaw tight, staring straight ahead. Miss Thornton didn't move. She had expected hesitation, maybe a clumsy start, but what she got was confidence measured honest and undeniably real. And Elijah, he wasn't playing for them. Not anymore. He played for the warm afternoons on his grandfather's porch, for the old man's gravelly hum keeping time beside him, for the memories wrapped in every chord and every run of his fingers across the keys. He played for his mother, who closed her eyes and smiled when he played in the living room, swaying gently with a dish towel still in her hand. He played for himself for all the times he'd been passed over, doubted, ignored. The room seemed to fade around him. There was no class, no teacher, no walls, just the sound of blues rolling forward, full of ache and joy and defiance. Elijah's fingers moved freely now, weaving through the melody with precision and feeling. He wasn't just playing music. He was speaking in a language only some understood, but all could feel. Then he took a chance. His hands shifted into a more complex progression, something his grandfather had spent months helping him master. He'd stumbled over it many times, frustrated and stubborn, until one night it finally clicked. And now here in front of this class that never really saw him, he let it fly. The melody soared. The bass line rolled deep and steady underneath, grounding each phrase like footsteps on solid ground. His fingers danced across the keys with an ease born not of performance, but of truth, of knowing. The silence in the room grew heavier, richer, no longer uncertain, but reverent. Every student sat still. Not one dared speak. Not one dared move. Elijah let the music build, carrying every doubt, every moment he had felt invisible. He let it crest into a bold, resonant crescendo, filling the classroom with a sound that stretched beyond those four walls. The chords rang out, echoing against the hard floor, the painted brick, the very breath in their lungs. Then he released it. The final note lingered in the air like smoke, slow to fade, reluctant to leave. Elijah's hands hovered above the keys for a moment longer, then settled in his lap. He didn't look up right away. He just breathed slow and steady, and the room stayed still. No one moved, not at first, then one clap. From the back, then another, and another. In seconds, the class erupted in applause. Tyler let out a quiet whistle. Man! Brandon, still sitting with his arms crossed, shook his head like he was trying to make sense of what he'd just seen. I didn't know he could do that. Neither did most of them. But Elijah had known. He sat there not smiling, not fishing for praise, just still letting the applause wash over him, not like a spotlight, but like rain on dry ground. The loudest silence, though, came from Miss Thornton. She hadn't moved. Her face was unreadable, her arms still crossed tight against her chest. She didn't clap, didn't speak. She simply stared. And Elijah, for the first time all year, looked right back at her, steady, sure. He had played more than just notes. He had played the truth. And every single person in that room had heard it. The final note faded like a memory that didn't want to leave. It hovered in the air, delicate and full of meaning, before slipping away into silence. Elijah sat motionless at the piano, his hands resting in his lap. His shoulders didn't rise in pride, nor did he glance around seeking approval. He simply breathed, calm and grounded, as if everything he needed had already happened the moment his fingers touched those keys. For a long moment the room was still. Then came a single clap from the back of the room, then another, and another. Within seconds, the quiet gave way to a steady applause that filled every corner of the classroom. Some students clapped loudly, others more hesitantly, still caught between surprise and wonder. Tyler let out a long, low whistle. Dang. Across the room, Brandon, usually the first to joke, shook his head slowly. I didn't know he could do that, he muttered, his voice almost respectful. Elijah looked out across the room now, and what he saw was different. These weren't the same glances of indifference or amusement he'd gotten before. These were the stares of kids who had just seen something they hadn't expected, something they couldn't explain away with a smirk or a shrug. But at the front of the room, Miss Thornton remained still. She didn't clap. She didn't smile. Her arms were crossed tightly, her lips pressed into a hard, unreadable line. She watched him with an expression that didn't quite register as surprise nor satisfaction. If anything, it looked like she was trying to make sense of what had just happened and failing. Elijah, she finally said, her voice clipped and flat. That was unexpected. The applause tapered off. Students glanced between her and Elijah, unsure of how to interpret her tone. Some looked puzzled. Others looked almost disappointed, like something important had just been missed. Elijah didn't flinch. He met her gaze without blinking. My grandfather, he said quietly, he taught me. Something flickered in Miss Thornton's expression, something almost human, but it passed too quickly to name. She shifted in place, her fingers tapping the edge of her desk once before she straightened. I see. She paused, then turned to the class. All right, let's get back to our lesson. But no one moved. Tyler was still watching Elijah, his eyebrows raised high like he was waiting for more. Madison, seated toward the back, looked annoyed, like something had been stolen from her too soon. Brandon let out a scoff and leaned back in his chair. That's it, he said, not loud, but not quiet either. Miss Thornton's eyes narrowed. Excuse me, Brandon gestured loosely. He just played like something you hear on TV and that's all you're gonna say. A few students nodded, murmuring in quiet agreement. Miss Thornton's jaw tightened. This is a classroom, not a talent show. Elijah inhaled slowly. He knew she wanted to move on, pretend it hadn't happened, wrap it all up and file it away under momentary distraction. But he wasn't ready to let it go. You didn't think I could play, he said, his voice calm. He wasn't accusing, just stating a truth. Her eyes snapped back to him, sharp and assessing. What? He didn't look away. That's why you asked me to play. You thought I'd mess up. A ripple of whispers spread through the class. No one had ever spoken to her like that, not Elijah, not anyone. I simply gave you an opportunity to share your talent, she replied a little too quickly. No, Elijah said, his voice steady. You didn't. He turned slightly, glancing at Tyler. You wouldn't have asked him, or Madison, or Brandon. You asked me. The room held its breath. Miss Thornton's posture stiffened. You're out of line. I don't think I am. A charged silence fell between them. Her eyes darkened, her fingers curling against the desk. Sit down. For a moment, Elijah didn't move, then slowly he walked back to his seat. The weight of the moment clung to every step. He didn't puff up or act proud. He just moved with the quiet assurance of someone who had already spoken all that needed saying. He lowered himself into his chair and folded his hands in his lap. The whispers around him hadn't stopped, but they felt different now. Less like noise, more like echoes of something that had changed. Tyler gave him a slow nod. No words, just a look that said, I saw that. Madison was still watching Miss Thornton, her arms crossed, waiting. Like the rest of them, she had noticed something in their teacher's expression, a crack in the surface. Miss Thornton turned away, flipping open her lesson plan like she hadn't just been challenged in front of everyone. Let's move on. But the room didn't move with her. The usual rhythm was broken. The quiet obedience she counted on had lost its edge. The lesson continued, but it no longer had its grip. Eyes drifted, minds wandered. And more than once, someone looked back at Elijah still sitting calmly at his desk as if they were seeing him for the first time. The bell eventually rang, chairs scraped against the floor, bags zipped, and feet shuffled toward the door. But just before Elijah stepped out, Miss Thornton called his name again. Elijah. He stopped and turned. For a second, she looked like she might say something real. Her eyes softened. Her mouth opened. Then she seemed to think better of it. I hope you understand, this is still my classroom, she said, the edge back in her voice. Elijah studied her, then nodded once, calm measured. I know. There was nothing more to say. He walked into the hallway, the door clicking shut behind him. And for the first time all year, he wasn't the one being dismissed. The hallway outside room 213 felt warmer than usual, like the air had thickened in the wake of everything that had just unfolded. Elijah walked in silence, the echo of his own footsteps, steady and sure. A few kids glanced his way, some wide-eyed, others wearing small, uncertain smiles, but no one said much. It wasn't the kind of moment that needed filling. Tyler caught up to him by the water fountain, eyes still wide with disbelief. Dude, he said, shaking his head. What was that? You flipped everything upside down. Elijah let out a breath, not quite a laugh. Yeah. You're gonna play again, right? Tyler asked, nudging his shoulder. Elijah didn't answer right away. He thought about the piano, about the keys beneath his fingers, the way the music had taken over, the way the room had changed. Yeah, he said softly. I think I will. By the time Elijah got home that afternoon, the sun was low in the sky, stretching long shadows across West Markham Street. He cut through the corner lot like he always did, passing Mr. Henson's corner store. The bell jingled as he stepped inside for a cold bottle of water. Mr. Henson, leaning on the counter with a newspaper folded in half, looked up and smiled with a familiar kind of knowing. You look like a kid who just did something important. Elijah paused, one hand on the fridge handle, then smiled back. Maybe I did. When he got home, the smell of fried catfish and cornbread greeted him like a warm blanket. His mom stood by the stove, humming as she flipped a fillet in the cast iron pan. Her voice faded as she turned and glanced over her shoulder. You're home late. Elijah dropped his bag near the door and took a seat at the kitchen table. Had a long day. Her eyes softened. Good long or bad long? He thought about it, really thought about the silence after the last note, the applause, the way Miss Thornton's voice cracked ever so slightly when she said it was still her classroom. Good, he said, really good. She turned off the burner and wiped her hands on a dish towel before sitting across from him. You want to talk about it? Elijah nodded, and for the next 15 minutes, he told her everything. From the moment Miss Thornton asked him to stay after class to the challenge hidden inside her request. He told her how he knew it was a setup, how the music had carried him, how the class had changed, and how she hadn't expected him to speak up afterward, but he had. His mother didn't interrupt. She just listened. Her expression moved gently through pride, concern, and something quieter, almost like grief. When he finished, she exhaled slowly. Sounds like you made her uncomfortable. I think I did, Elijah said. She studied him for a moment, then asked, and how do you feel about that? He looked her in the eyes, like it was supposed to happen. She reached across the table, took his hand in hers, and gave it a squeeze. Good. The next morning at school, the building looked the same, but something in the atmosphere had shifted. The walls hadn't moved, the floors hadn't changed, but the way people looked at Elijah had. Not dramatically, not like they were falling over themselves to be his friend, but differently. Eyes that once passed over him now paused. Kids who had never spoken to him before gave small nods in the hallway or whispered things behind cupped hands when he walked past. In the lunchroom, Madison Green, who had barely acknowledged him since September, sat across from him with her tray. That was insane yesterday, she said plainly. How long have you been playing? Since I was 5, Elijah replied. You've been holding out on us. Tyler chimed in from next to him, grinning. Elijah gave a small smirk. Guess so. From across the cafeteria, Miss Thornton walked by with a lunch tray in her hands. Their eyes met just for a second. This time she looked away first. And Elijah, he just kept eating. There were no more words needed. Some lessons don't come from books. Some don't show up in test scores or roll calls. Some are born from a moment, just one, and that moment rewrites everything. Miss Thornton had spent nearly a full school year looking through Elijah, not at him, past him, and in less than 5 minutes he had made sure she could never do it again. Maybe she'd never say it out loud. Maybe she'd never admit what she had assumed or how she had used her authority. But it didn't matter, because Elijah had learned something she hadn't. When someone tries to define you by their own limitations, when they expect you to be small, to stumble, to fade, the most powerful thing you can do is let your gift speak for itself. And when it does, when it rises higher than their doubt, they'll have no choice but to listen, even if they never say a word. The next day in room 213, the desks were still lined up the same way, the bulletin board still covered in faded Civil War posters, and Miss Thornton still stood at the front of the class with her lesson plan in hand. But something in the room had shifted. You couldn't see it. You could only feel it. Elijah took his usual seat by the window, the same seat he had occupied all year. But for the first time, it didn't feel like hiding. It felt like arriving. Eyes followed him, not in judgment or mockery, but in acknowledgement. Some still uncertain, some curious, and some, like Tyler's, quietly proud. Miss Thornton began the lesson just as she always did, voice steady, posture straight. But there was a thinness to her authority now, like a pane of glass that had been cracked right down the middle. Still standing, still whole, but changed forever. She called on the same students she always had, skipped over the same ones she always did, pretended like nothing unusual had happened the day before. But the class didn't fall back in line as easily. The rhythm was off. The room didn't move with her in quite the same way. Every time she glanced in Elijah's direction, she blinked just a little too long, as if expecting him to speak up again, and maybe fearing he would. At lunch, things felt different too. Elijah sat at his usual table, but today it wasn't empty. A few classmates, ones who had never said more than 2 words to him, stopped by. "You're seriously good," said Aiden Chen, balancing a milk carton in one hand. "My older brother plays jazz drums. He'd probably freak out hearing you play." Elijah smiled faintly. "Thanks." Madison pulled out a chair across from him and sat down like it was something she'd been doing all year. "You really never told anyone?" she asked. "I wasn't trying to hide it," Elijah said. "No one ever asked." Tyler chuckled. "We've been over here arguing about whether or not you've got a record deal we don't know about." Elijah smirked. "Not yet." The conversation flowed easily, no drama, no disbelief, just honest curiosity. And respect. That was new. Over near the cafeteria entrance, Miss Thornton passed through with her tray. She kept her eyes low as she walked by, but for just a second, her gaze flicked toward their table. Elijah caught it. Their eyes met again. Brief, still, and then she looked away. He didn't, because something had shifted between them now. Not just because he played well, not just because he spoke up, but because she had seen something she hadn't been willing to see before, and so had everyone else. Later that week, the ripple lingered in small but telling ways. Brandon, who used to roll his eyes whenever Elijah raised his hand, asked if he could hear him play again sometime. A few students started sitting closer to Elijah during group work, including Madison, who asked him once, "How do you even think like that when you're playing?" He shrugged. "I don't think, I just feel it." And Miss Thornton, well, she kept up appearances, her voice stayed firm. Her lessons stayed tight. But there were pauses now, cracks in the rhythm, moments when she would glance at Elijah and look away quickly like she didn't want to be caught noticing. One afternoon during a quiet worksheet period, she called on him to answer a history question. He answered easily, and instead of moving on quickly like she used to, she nodded. "Correct," she said. "No more, no less." But her tone was different. It wasn't warm, but it was no longer dismissive. And that was enough. By the end of the week, the classroom felt like a place where things had been shaken loose, where expectations had shifted, even if no one said it outright. It was in the way students talked to each other, the way they looked at Elijah, the way silence filled the room a little differently now. It wasn't about the music anymore. It was about how one moment, one act of courage had cracked something open. And once opened, it couldn't be closed again. Elijah hadn't asked for attention. He hadn't gone looking for a stage. But when it found him, when that old piano became his voice, he used it, and it reached everyone, even the one who'd underestimated him most. He didn't need her to admit it. He didn't need a thank you or a change in tone, because now the room saw him, not as a kid who sat quietly by the window, not as someone to overlook, but as someone with a voice worth hearing. And once you've been seen like that, really seen, there's no going back to invisible. The sun hung low over Little Rock as Elijah made his way home, weaving through the familiar streets of his neighborhood. The late lights softened everything, the sidewalks, the storefronts, even the shadows. There was something different in his step, something lighter, as if a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying had finally been lifted. He stopped by Mr. Henson's store again, just like the day before. The old man gave him a nod, didn't say much. This time he didn't need to. Some things are understood without words. By the time Elijah reached his front door, the smell of home was already waiting for him, catfish sizzling in the pan, warm cornbread cooling on the counter. His mother was humming again, her voice soft and steady as she moved through the kitchen. When he walked in, she turned, eyes lighting up. "You're late again," she said, smiling. Elijah set his backpack down and eased into his usual chair at the kitchen table. "Had a lot on my mind." She wiped her hands on a towel and sat across from him. "Want to talk about it?" He nodded, and just like the day before, he told her about how people were looking at him differently now, about how no one quite knew what to say, but they were saying something all the same, about how Miss Thornton was quieter, more careful, like she was still sorting through what had happened. His mother listened, eyes full of something soft and strong. When he finished, she reached over and took his hand in hers. "You were seen," she said gently. "Truly seen." Elijah smiled. "Yeah, I was, and that was enough." This wasn't a story about music, not really. It was about being overlooked, about being underestimated, and about what happens when someone chooses not to shrink under the weight of another's assumptions, but to rise. Elijah didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply let his gift speak for him. And that quiet strength, that steady courage, is something we all carry. Sometimes it only takes a single moment to remind the world who we are. So if you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever been doubted, remember this. The truth of who you are is louder than anyone's silence. And when your moment comes, let it speak. If this story moved you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. You are welcome to leave a comment, share a memory, or just say hello. And if you'd like to hear more true human stories like this, gentle, real, and full of heart, feel free to subscribe. I'm grateful you're here. Thanks for listening.